Long before your popularity was determined by how many followers you have on social media, the ultimate status symbol of the rich and famous was orchids. People in Victorian-era Europe became so obsessed with obtaining and showing off their orchids that people's lives were often an afterthought in the collection of these rare flowers. This phenomenon was given the name orchid delirium. In fact, it got so out of control that wealthy orchid fanatics would often pay explorers to travel all across the globe in search of new orchids to add to their collection. These commissioned collectors would travel for months to many different countries in search of rare new species of orchids. The orchid expeditions were often shrouded in secrecy, and oftentimes the collectors would spread misinformation to other collectors, so they would search in the wrong places. Many different collectors saw the rise in orchid popularity as an opportunity in the making. As you can imagine, some aspects of collecting these rare flowers provided many opportunities for fraud too. Some so-called orchid hunters would take the money that they were supposed to use to fund an orchid hunting trip and live it up in a neighboring city for a few months. When the money almost ran out, they would quickly purchase a few common orchids from other collectors and return with their finds. One of the most famous orchid hunters was Frederick Sanders, who was known as the Orchid King of St. Albans. Between 1880 and 1890, he imported more than 2 million orchids into Europe from around the world. It wasn't Sanders himself that would go out and collect these mysterious flowers. He actually had a number of men on his books that would travel around and do it for him. Of the 23 collectors in his field, half of them died on the job due to the harsh and dangerous locations that they would travel to. Orchid hunters hated each other too. They would often battle over territory and try and ruin the stash of other collectors. According to one story, an orchid hunter named William Arnold followed his rival around the jungles of Venezuela and collected the same flowers that he discovered. When the rival hunter was almost finished, William urinated all over his rival's collection of orchids, ruining them all. Despite the long and treacherous journeys to obtain the orchids, many of them would often perish on the ride back to Europe. A shockingly high percentage of these flowers were ruined during transportation. New exotic orchids would most often be sold in London sales rooms, where they would sell for outrageous prices. At the time, many Europeans had absolutely no idea how to take care of these exotic plants, and their survival rates were almost non-existent. Tropical orchids mainly grow above ground and typically use another plant for support. The plantsmen of Europe did not know this, and tried planting the orchids in the ground like a typical plant, which resulted in their deaths. Through experimentation and a deeper understanding of the growing conditions of orchids in their natural habitat, orchidologist Benjamin Samuel Williams published his famous book, The Orchid Grower's Manual, which spread quickly throughout 19th century Europe. By the end of the 19th century, there was enough experience and knowledge of orchids that growing them in European greenhouses was much easier than before. Today, collecting orchids in the wild is now banned because of all the endangered species. Many scientists agree that orchid delirium of the 19th century contributed to the loss of certain orchid species. In 1973, the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora banned the practice of wild orchid collection, putting an end to the legal orchid hunters. These days, you need a license to even look at some of the rarest orchids. And when a new species is discovered, it is a very safely guarded secret, because there are still illegal modern-day orchid hunters who won't hesitate to snatch them up. Growing your orchids is much easier today thanks to knowledge on the internet. Even though they are nowhere near as expensive as they once were, orchids are still one of the most captivating and beautiful flowers in existence.